So for this build, I wanted to do something a little different, and I went with some sapele and canary wood since they have a good contrast and they add a little bit of character to the front of the house. And I wanted to bring some more warmth to the front of the house, so I think this lumber choice really made sense. So once I had the boards planed down to their final thickness, I took them over to the miter saw to cut them down to rough length. Because these boards are so wide, I took the cuts in 2 passes, cutting about halfway through on each pass to avoid any binding. Now normally I cut down my lumber first, but I wanted to thickness these boards down to start so that I can minimize and manage the amount of snipe I might get over at the planer. For smaller boards that are under 6 inches, I just take that in 1 pass because the saw can handle that pretty easily. But if this was an inch or thicker, I'd take that in 2 passes as well. Alright, so once I had the boards cut to rough length, I took them over to the joiner to put a clean edge on one side. And for this project, it's kind of important to start with really clean edges, just because of the overall length of the planer boxes themselves. So in this instance, size matters. Jonathan Katz-Moses. Alright, so over at the table saw, I set it up to rip the boards to final width. And to do that again, I'm going to use a feather board and my table saw fence. And I'll put that newly jointed edge against the fence and make a nice smooth cut. When ripping long boards like this, I try to focus my energy on lifting the back so that it makes good contact with the table surface. The feather board does the work of holding it against the fence, so I don't really have to worry about anything there. Oh, and before I forget, if you want to build this project for yourself, I'll have plans linked down in the description below. And I gotta say, coming off back-to-back projects of working with maple and walnut, working with sapele was really refreshing. Because even though it's harder than walnut, because it's straight grain, it rips really easily. The canary wood on the other hand was just hard altogether. Kobe! So when all was said and done, I had 8 boards that were milled down to their final width and rough length. Alright, so now that we have all the boards roughed out, I'm going to trim them down to the final length here at the table saw using the crosscut sled, and then I'm going to use my miter gauge to cut in that angle for the front and back panels. So once I had my blade height set at the crosscut sled, I went ahead and trimmed a clean edge onto all the boards. I didn't buy any extra lumber for this project because the supplier didn't have any more, so I was really conservative with the amount of material I was removing here, as I really need every inch. Or for my international viewers, 25.4 millimeters. So with my larger pieces cut down, I could focus on the end caps. And those are going to be 2 different sizes because one's going to sit vertically and the other will sit on an angle in a stopped dado. So once I had marked out their length, I cut them at the crosscut sled. If I was cutting more than just 2 of these, I'd use a stop, but I didn't think it was needed here. The last piece is to cut down with the bases of the planer boxes, and to do that, I cut them a little long, knowing that I'm going to creep back up on the cut later on for the beveled angle. This is one of those instances where I'm glad that I saved a few of those millimeters, or inches, so that I can base the cut off the actual dimension when I get there and not rely solely on my plans. Alright, so next up were the angled front and back panels. So I start by finding the furthest point of the angle on my boards, and then I use my bevel gauge to mark it out. I find it useful to mark out a rough area of what I think the angle is going to be on my board. This way when I'm laying things out, I don't get confused about what should be the front facing angle and what should be the back. That's what that little red marking means to me on the left. And that's the kind of stuff we went over in that video about woodworking tools that aren't really tools. So once I had all my pieces laid out, I could set up my miter gauge for the cut. My miter gauge here is going to act more like a sled than it is a set stop, and that's because these boards are far too long for the miter gauge to have a stop that's useful. So here I'm just going to test out my cut, starting wide and then sneaking up to the line. And here I'll sneak in a request to say that if you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button so that it can spread to more people. Thank you. From there I just repeated the process, sneaking up to my line until all the boards were cut. Alright, so with our panels cut to their final dimension, we can go ahead and cut in the rabbets in our front and back panels, and then we'll create an adjoining rabbet in our center divider piece that'll give us that double rabbet joint. Let's go ahead and get these laid out, and then we'll get them cut out over at the router table. So since these rabbet joints aren't going to go all the way through the board, I first needed to lay out where those stops were going to occur. And here I'm going to use some blue tape so I know where to stop when I'm cutting these rabbets over at the router table. I like to use tape in this scenario because it's easier to see and it's a better visual indicator. So once I had all the stopped rabbets laid out, I could set up the router table. And these rabbets are going to be 1/4 inch deep and 1/2 inch wide. Because these are stopped rabbets, I like to use the edge of the fence to pivot the workpiece into the bit. This helps avoid tear out and lessens any sudden start or stop at the router table. And when I'm working at the router table, I'm shooting for a rabbet that's 90 to 95% there. Any issues that I have with the rabbets, I can clean up with a chisel or a plane later on. One issue I did run into though was that my fence moved on one of my longer boards. Luckily I was able to save that piece and cut the rabbet to the full thickness of the board. So that rabbet will just be a sanded rabbet rather than the double rabbet that will happen to all the other boards. Rabbet. For the ends, I was just careful not to lift the boards too much and cut the rabbets too deep. Next, I could lay out the adjoining rabbets onto the caps and base, and I cut those the same way over at the router table, just mirroring the rabbet size so that it would fit in the front and back paneled rabbets. So these rabbets are only a 1/4 inch by a 1/4 inch, which will mirror and match nicely with the previously cut rabbets. Since the base pieces are going to be end set by the caps, I didn't have to worry about cutting any stopped rabbets there, so I could just power through those. Next up are the angled dados. So the first thing I needed to do was lay those out with my bevel gauge. These dados are going to match the same angle that we cut onto the ends of the boards. And since these are stop dados, I needed to also mark out my stopping point. When laying out the stop dados, it was also important to remember that these pieces mirror each other to make sure that the stop dados were positioned correctly in space. So once I had those stop dados confidently marked out, I set up the router so that the bit was exactly the same depth that we were cutting at the router table. And then using my router's fence against the edge, cut in the dados. For the front boards, I just set the router to the depth and then pulled it through the workpiece. The downcut bit works great here because it gives me a nice crispy top edge. On the rear boards, however, I used the plunge feature to start my cut in the center of the board and work my way out. For each face, I needed to adjust the fence width just because they exist in different places on the boards. Fine-tuning them just takes a little bit of time. So next it was time to clean up those rabbets and dados. And to do that, I'm going to use a combination of planes and chisels. Now, the planes aren't 100% needed here, but I like the consistency and accuracy a plane gives me. The chisels, however, are super useful for straightening out those rounded corners that were left by the router bit. When working with chisels, my best advice is to first take your time, and just take small cuts, nibbling away at your piece until you achieve the desired dimension. And this whole process is much easier with sharp chisels, so be sure to sharpen your chisels often. And like sharpening your chisels, it's important to sharpen your skills. So subscribe so you don't miss the next project packed with woodworking tips and tricks. And thank you for your support. So once I had those rounded edges cleaned up, I could plane down the edges of my board. This will flatten out any imperfections and take out those table saw marks. From there, I could repeat that process on the canarywood boards. And as I said earlier, this wood is a lot harder than sapele, so this one was definitely a little more difficult to chisel out, but did eventually get there. To clean up the rabbets, I'm going to use my shoulder plane, again just to clean up those router marks. And then I'll go back to my number 4 to clean up the edges, which was really fun in the canarywood because it left me with these really nice red curls. And while I can't really do anything with them, they're just really satisfying. It's like the more pure version of the plastic peel on a new phone. Alright, so next it was time to lay out and cut the bevels for the bottoms. Now for the most part, I'm going to treat these the same way I did the front and back panels and sneak up to my cut. It's important to remember that these bevels are going to be slightly longer than the rabbets we cut, because they're going to carry over into the angled dado. For the smaller end caps, I did sneak up to those cuts using the stops so that I could repeat that cut on both ends. With all my pieces cut down, I could finally do a test fit, and I gotta say, I was pretty happy with the initial fit of everything. So before I went any further, I gave everything an initial sanding, just because it's much easier to sand the pieces now when they're apart than it would be later, and when I'm finessing those joints, I want to make sure they're fully sanded, though we don't need to watch all that. So next it was time to get started on that hidden key storage, and to do that I'm going to lay out and mark a line on my angled end cap. This indicates where I want to stop the cut so that I have a nice seamless joint where the panel goes. To remove this section, I'm going to use my bandsaw. So I set my blade to just under the width of the rabbet and made a cut to my line. If I didn't have a bandsaw, I'd cut this piece over at my table saw. I would use a tenon jig to cut the piece vertically and push it safely over the blade. From there, I widened my fence slightly to offset for the blade, and then cut another piece that had the same bevel angle. This will be the piece that I'll replace the offcut with. To complete the cut, I just used a pull saw. And though I did cut a little too deep here, I'm not super worried about it because it's going to be hidden from the outside. From there, I just used my shoulder plane to clean up that shoulder. Again, a chisel and a marking knife would work fine here. From there, I trimmed the panel down to its final length and width over at the crosscut sled. Once I had it to its final dimension, I took it over to the drum sander to finalize its thickness. Then from there, I could test the fit. Alright, so we're on the home stretch. I have a couple of joints to clean up still. Then we're going to drill in some drainage holes so that we don't have excess water building up in the planters. Then we'll cut out some French cleats to hang these guys. So let's get those holes drilled in now so we can get these guys glued up. Alright, so first things first, I needed to mark out the center of my boards. Then I laid out drainage holes every 6 inches along the length. From there, I drilled out the holes using a 1/4 inch bit. To avoid blowing out the bottom side of the holes, I clamped the board down to some scraps of MDF, and my blue tape flag let me know when I'd reached the desired depth. Next up was the compartment to hold the key. So I first needed to mark it out, and I just traced around the key and filled in the area that I felt would fit a key comfortably. Once I had it roughed out, I laid out some lines so that I could get it close to where I wanted to, then took it over to the drill press to remove the bulk of the material. Using a Forstner bit, I carved out 2 sections along the center of my marking. I didn't have an exact location or depth in mind here, I just wanted to make sure that it was large enough to fit a key or two. And in place of a drill press and Forstner bit, a router would work fine too. You just want to make sure you get as much material out as possible. So once I had the bulk of the material removed, I used a marking knife to lay out my shape just beyond the circles. Then went at removing the remaining material with my chisels. I tried to use the widest chisel I have for this procedure, so that I have less lines overlapping and have an overall cleaner result. At this point, I'm not looking for perfection, I'm looking for it to be about 95% there. Once I felt pretty good about where I was at, I sanded out the bottom markings and then used some CA glue to fill in the indentions left by the Forstner bit. I'll come back and clean this up a little bit more later before I apply finish. So after I dropped in a few drops of CA glue and applied some activator, I dropped in the key to see how it fit. And while this might not hold the key to happiness, it can definitely hold the key to your front door. So next up was to drop in some magnets to hold this panel in place. Now, while friction will hold this most of the way, I wanted to add the magnets just to give me some more reassurance that the panel is not going to fly off and expose my key to the world, or my neighbor. So once I drilled in a few holes, I popped in a couple of rare earth magnets and jostled the key around a bit. And then mirror those holes on the adjoining panel and then popped in a couple magnets. And just like that, a hidden storage Olmec would be proud of. To ease all the edges on the piece, I'm using a roundover plane. Now another option would be to use a roundover bit and a palm router, or you could just hand sand them. Either way, just make sure you don't neglect the edges because it really adds character to the piece and makes it look more finished. So with all my outside facing edges rounded over, it was time for the glue up. Now, since these are planer boxes and they're going to obviously see a lot of water, both on the interior and probably on the exterior, I'm going to go ahead and use a waterproof glue. Now, while sapele and canary wood are both rot resistant lumbers, the joints are obviously going to expand and contract. So we want to use the appropriate glue for the project. And I'm not oversaturating the joints here, but I'm getting an appropriate amount of squeeze out, which is a thin line out of each joint. But that's my opinion. Let me know if you're a drippy glue user down in the comments. You know who you are. So next up, it was time to cut out our French cleats that we'll use to mount our planer boxes. And to do that, I just set my table saw to 45 degrees and ripped 2 boards that are about 6 inches in width in half. And when you do that, you'll probably be left with this little nub at the end, which is really easy to clean up with a hand plane or a sanding block. So next I use my CNC to cut out the house numbers. If you don't have a CNC, you can obviously purchase these, or you could try your hand at cutting them out of the scroll saw. I think there's a couple of different options you have here. But since I have a CNC, that's what I used. Not to mention using a CNC allows me to customize my typeface. From there, I just use a rattle can to spray paint the numbers black to give them some contrast from the canary wood. Just make sure that when you're spraying stuff that has fumes in the shop, you open a door and wear the appropriate mask. Once the glue had cured, I could finesse the edge on my magnetic panel. And yeah, I was pretty stoked when it just popped right in. So with everything assembled, I gave both boxes a final sanding up to 220 grit. But again, I'm not going to bore you with that footage. Though those bottom rabbets do look nice. Then I could leave my mark so that the next family who lives in this home will know these boxes were made with care. From there, it was time to attach our French cleats. So once I had marked out a line across the top, I drilled in some pilot holes and then drove in a couple screws. Once I had a screw on either end and I ensured that my cleat was lined up, I removed one screw, applied a bead of glue, and then drove in the remaining screws. If you'd like to support the channel, I'd invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get things like discount codes on project plans and t-shirts, plus some free stickers, and a huge thank you from me. Oh, and I also just started a Discord server, so the link to that will be in there as well. So I hope to see you there. For the finish on these boxes, I'm using Osmo's UV protection oil. I just applied one coat with a brush, waited about 12 hours, and then applied a second coat. While these boxes won't be exposed to direct sunlight all day long, they are going to have about 6 hours a day in the sun, so I want to give them the best protection I can. Once the finish had 24 hours to cure, I applied the numbers to the address panel. And to do that, I just used some Starbond CA glue to hold the numbers in place while the wood glue dried. Now your home may have more or less numbers than mine does, so you're going to have to address the panel size accordingly. From there, I lined the interior of the boxes with 3mm plastic. Now while you could tack these in, I didn't feel like I wanted to make it a permanent solution, so I just dropped it in and I'll use the weight of the dirt to hold the plastic in place. I'll just use something like an awl or a skewer to poke holes in the plastic to make sure it has the appropriate drainage. Then from there I could glue and screw the number panel to the larger box. Once I had the 4 screws in place, I went over to my drill press and cut a couple plugs to plug those holes. So once I popped them out, I got the grain facing in the appropriate direction, tapped them in place, flush trimmed them, and then sanded them down. This obviously meant this section needed to be refinished, but that didn't take too long. Then it was finally time to mount the French cleats to the house. Because our home is wrapped in vinyl siding, I had to mount a 1/2-inch strip to the siding first to give me a flat surface to mount the French cleat to. Thankfully that small 1/2-inch recess in the siding allows for the planter boxes to sit really nicely against the wall. And with the lower larger box mounted, I could repeat the process for the upper one. And for my keen eye viewers, this isn't a continuity error, I just didn't want to have to edit out my address in the mounting process. So all that's left now is to add some dirt and some plants. And boom, these things turned out awesome. The contrast between the sapele and the canarywood looks fantastic and goes great with our color scheme. Plus the design has some really nice modern lines. The hidden key storage is pretty awesome too, though I'm not sure I'm going to be able to use it because, you know, the internet. If you enjoyed this project and you want to see more like it, check out this video over here next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.